I was 6 years old, I apparently said to my mother that I thought our lives were God's dream. My subsequent education eclipsed that intuition, but it never completely eradicated it. And it surfaced again 10 years later in my interest in Vedanta. For the next 20 years I studied and practiced the Vedanta teaching until I met Francis, who introduced me to the direct path and also the approach to the body of Kashmir Shaivism, which he had learned from Jean Klein. After 14 years with Francis, I began to write and speak about these matters. And now, 6 years later, I find myself in exactly the same position that I started as a 6-year-old boy. Feeling that our lives are God's dream, although I would no longer express it in these terms. Rather, I would say that each of our minds are precipitated in, informed by, and made of the same infinite, indivisible field of consciousness. Now, when I say each of our minds are precipitated in the same field of consciousness, I give credence to the idea, to the belief in a multiplicity and diversity of minds, which is itself an extension of the belief in a multiplicity and diversity of bodies. Each of our minds is capable of numerous thoughts and perceptions. But none of those thoughts or perceptions ever have an existence of their own, independent of the mind in which they appear. In other words, there is no such thing as a discrete object called a thought or a perception. It is not possible to pluck a thought or a perception out of your mind. In other words, each thought or perception is not, in fact, a discrete object with its own independent existence. It is simply the activity of your own mind. There is no such thing as a thought or a perception. There is just your mind and its own activity. Likewise, there is no such thing as a multiplicity and diversity of separate minds. In fact, there is no such thing as a mind. It is not possible to pluck a mind out of consciousness. The mind does not exist as a discrete object with its own independent existence. Each of our minds is simply the activity of consciousness. There is just consciousness and its activity. When we fall asleep at night, our mind dreams a world within itself. But in order to dream the world, our mind must fall asleep. In other words, in the waking state, our mind cannot know the dreamed world. In order to know the dreamed world, in order to manifest the dreamed world within itself, our mind must fall asleep to itself and enter its own imagination, enter its own dream in the form of a separate subject of experience, the dreamed character, from whose point of view it is able to know or perceive the world. Exactly the same thing happens in consciousness. The infinite can only know the infinite. The finite can only be known by the finite. In other words, it is not possible for infinite consciousness to know manifestation, form, the universe by itself. In order to know a world, infinite consciousness must fall asleep to itself. It must ignore or overlook the reality of its own mind and enter into its own imagination in the form of the separate subject of experience, that is each of us, from whose point of view it is able to know itself as the world. In other words, when infinite consciousness falls asleep to itself, it wakes up as the finite mind. And when the finite mind falls asleep to itself, it wakes up as infinite consciousness. This is the meaning of the phrase in the Bhagavad Gita, which is usually translated as, "What is sleep for the sage is waking for the ignorant, and what is sleep for the ignorant is waking for the sage." The esoteric meaning of this sentence is that consciousness has to fall asleep to itself. It must overlook the knowing of its own being and collapse into the finite mind, from whose point of view it is able to know itself as the world. In other words, each of our finite minds are precipitated within the same field of infinite consciousness, and each of our minds gives infinite consciousness a window onto itself. Each of our minds enables infinite consciousness to realize a segment of its infinite potential and to know itself as the world. The reason we all seem to know the same world is not because there is one world out there made out of matter. It is because each of our minds are precipitated within, informed by and made of the same consciousness. The sameness of the world we share is the sameness